International Conference on Afghanistan. The Americans were there to get support for a changed approach, more help to build the country, attempts to bring moderate elements of the Taliban back into civil society, and a great emphasis on a regional solution. Thomas Schweik can tell us how things are going. He's a former U.S. ambassador for counter-narcotics and justice reform in Afghanistan. He's now visiting professor of law at Washington University in St. Louis. One of the interesting things, Professor, about this conference was I found that both the United States and Iran had representatives there. What is the common ground between Washington and Tehran when it comes to Afghanistan?
Well, I think the biggest common ground, Suhanna, is the drugs trade. As we all know, and the Canadians know more than anybody else, the drug trade is funding the insurgency that's killing our troops. Afghanistan produces 90% of the world's heroin. Over half of that transits through Iran. So they've got a massive drug addiction problem there. Some statistics, I think the UN said, 3 million people using illegal opiates in Iran. So we have a common interest there, and I think it's a great place to start when you have a problem with a country like the U.S. has with Iran, on something where you have common interests, rather than where you have a divergent interest, like on issues like Israel or their nuclear program. So this is a really good place to start.
And you've written certainly extensively about the drug trade in Afghanistan. Iran's deputy foreign minister apparently called for coordinated measures and strengthening regional cooperation on border security to deal with the problem. How significant is that, do you think?
It's really good to hear that from the Iranians because, as you know, President Obama's initial broad overture to the Iranians met with a stiff rebuke. This sounds like a much more cooperative type language, much more conciliatory, and much more constructive. So I'm very encouraged by what he said.
A cornerstone of the Obama administration's Afghanistan plan is an influx of troops. And Iran, I mean, if there's a difference, Iran says foreign troops have not been successful in the past, that more troops, in fact, won't help. How do you view the troop strategy?
Well, it's an interesting issue because I agree that if you put a lot of troops in who are not well trained and don't understand the area or the culture, you have civilian casualties and misunderstandings, and it can actually be counterproductive. But what President Obama said he's going to do, and this really isn't that much different than what President Bush was trying to do as well, is send more troops in to train the Afghans, train the National Army, and more civilian advisors to train the police so the Afghans can take care of themselves. And if that's the principal objective, along with bringing security for the elections, then I think the new troops will have a very constructive role to play.
You mentioned civilian casualties, Thomas. Is that one of the single greatest reasons why, the forces lose support amongst the, Afghans?
Definitely. All you have to do is go into one of the Afghan provinces, and they say, bring us security, don't bring us violence. So I think that if we focus on providing security, making sure that people in their towns feel safe, they'll help us root out the terrorists and the Taliban. That's probably the best way to go after terrorism.
And how much does success in Afghanistan depend also on Pakistan's involvement? We've been hearing a lot about that in the recent days. Pakistan's involvement in fighting insurgents along that border.
It's critical because they have a safe haven in the tribal areas right now. And let's not forget, with all due bluntness, that Pakistan helped to create the Taliban because they were unhappy with the Mujahideen civil war after the fall of the Soviet occupation, and so they have very long-standing connections to the Taliban, and we think that some people in the Pakistani government are actually sympathetic to the Taliban. So working with Pakistan to improve their own capacity to fight the Taliban and providing the civilian government the support it needs to distance itself from those parts of the government that like the Taliban is absolutely critical.
And what's going to be the greatest challenge on the Pakistan front, do you think?
Well, I think what I just said is part of it. There are parts of the Pakistani government that are sympathetic to the Taliban. So we can sink all the money and resources and effort into Pakistan, but if their government is actually helping the Taliban, or parts of the government, it's really very critical to say parts of the government, it's not going to be successful. So getting that shadowy relationship between the interagency intelligence services, Pakistan's ISI, and the Taliban cut, getting that relationship cut is going to be very critical and very difficult.
When it comes to the Karzai government, let's talk about that just for a moment. Afghanistan's presidential election coming up in August. How much support is there in Washington for Hamid Karzai, considering, all the stories of corruption, et cetera, that we've been hearing?
Yeah, and I've been one of the people who've been very critical of his level of corruption. My approach has been, and I've written about this, is it really doesn't matter how much support there is in Washington. We can put pressure on President Karzai to reduce corruption and clean up his government because we're providing a lot of funding and supporting him. But we have to recognize this is a sovereign government and a sovereign country, and we don't really have a right to decide who's going to be their president. So we can say, President Karzai, crack down on corruption, improve your government, and then the only other thing we're supposed to do is ensure free and fair elections. I think that's really as far as we should go.
Professor Thomas Schweik joining us from St. Louis. I want to thank you for your time.